Hi, this is Paul. I want to continue working on this video. Is the pandemic forcing secularists to broaden their definition of religion? And we're going to continue to talk about what is, and how language works, and what narrative is. And there's actually been a ton of stuff that I can bring in here. The session from Jordan Peterson's conversation with Joe Rogan. It's a video that he posted on the YouTube, basically his clips channel. It's a little bit of the clip, and actually the broader take on the conversation was even better than this little clip. Basically, what he talks about is that the Bible is this interpretive framework through which the West creates its civilization. And he talks about civilization in terms of basically a common set of categories through which you can create a structure, through which you can create a shared reality. The whole point of the Rebel Wisdom video on the religious wars of the pandemic endgame is that the shared reality of the West is breaking down in some significant ways. What's quite amazing about this is that we all participate in a culture that we know in a way that we really struggle to explicitly put into words or to represent with each other. Cultures are like that, and if you've ever had the experience of living in a very different culture from the one you grew up in, or even perhaps in a subculture which is connected to the culture that you live within, you can tell this. Now, in the video, David Fuller and Ollie refer to Paul Kingsnorth quite a bit in this paper that he did, the pandemic, the vaccine moment. And he has taken these 3 Substack posts and he has made a little PDF booklet about it, and you can download that and you can read that for free, and I'll put the notes to it in the comment. Now, he talks quite a bit about the myth of progress and about many of these issues. The historian Christopher Dawson described our region of the world, which has been so dominated for the last few centuries and is now fading in power and influence, as a Christian society overlaid on a barbarian substrate. Western European church is dominated by this sharp dualism between two cultures, two social transitions, two spiritual worlds, the war society of the barbarian kingdoms and its cult of heroism and aggression, and the peace society of the Christian church with its ideals of asceticism and renunciation and its high theological culture. Now, again, these things are far too massive for us to sort of see as such. I, for a while, was watching the Netflix series The Last Kingdom, in which this barbarian, the Danes have invaded England, and Athelstan and the Saxons, West Saxony, is trying to resist the ongoing Northman invasion. And the story is about a hero in the midst of this as he tries to make his way through it. But you get the tensions within, let's say, the Danish, the great Norwegian kingdoms, the Norse kingdoms, and then some of these other kingdoms that are resisting it. And you can very much feel the tension between the Vikings and the Christians to the south. I believe that is to be regarded as the principal source of the dynamic elements, which is of such decisive significance of Western culture. The mix of barbarian sinew and Christian faith, with its undergirden of classic thought, which is what made the West. For 1,000 years, medieval Christendom survived as a world entire in itself. Then, from the Reformation onwards, through the Enlightenment, Empire, and the rise of science, the Christian story was first challenged and then gradually superseded by another, the story of progress. This story was the subject of our little manifesto 12 years ago. onto the rootstock of Western Christianity, the Enlightenment, and at its most optimistic, grafted a vision of an earthly paradise towards which human effort, guided by calculative reason, could take us. Following this guidance, each generation will live a better life than the life of those that went before it. You can find this in presidential speeches, for example. Ronald Reagan's challenge, is your life better than it was 4 years ago? Anxiety about ongoing decadence, that perhaps our children will have it less good than we had it before them. This progress is sort of the measuring stick that we use to guide the civilization. History becomes an escalator, and the only way is up. On the top floor is human perfection. It is important that this should remain just out of reach in order to sustain the sensation of movement. But the myth of progress hit the buffers in the second half of the 20th century. After Auschwitz, after Hiroshima, who could believe it? Then again, there was, of course, the end of history and that thesis that, the domination of the Western powers then was this was the pinnacle. Those of us who are my age and older can still remember that the year 2000 was supposed to look like when we were children. It was jetpacks and flying cars, moon colonies, electricity too cheap to meter. Nobody mentions climate change or spiraling extinction rates or the bullshit jobs or the ocean gyres swimming in plastic or the billionaires in their bunkers or children digging up coltan for the smartphones put together by other children in sweatshops we never see. The West was Christendom, but Christendom died. Then the West was progress, but progress died. From this vantage point, perhaps still too close to really make out the shape of things, I suspect that the last decade was the period during which this reality hit home for many people. Now, it's very interesting to note that if you listen to Jordan Peterson on Joe Rogan, and in fact, a number of his second wave conversations, Peterson in many ways continues to promote the myth of progress, and that if the Western foundations can be sustained, well, then everything will be okay. I suspect that the last decade was the period during which this reality hit home for many people. The grand story we grew up with is now impossible, even for many former true believers to cleave to. In response, we have to enter a period we could call narrative fracture. I really like this, how he puts this together. Once we might have been able to cleave to a grand narrative like the story of progress, or smaller but nonetheless unifying stories like those built around nation states, it is now almost impossible to do so at any scale. The narratives are too fractured, everything moves too fast, and the center will not hold. This is the meaning of the culture war, an ongoing battle over stories with no sign at all of whether any new grand narrative will rise to replace that of progress. Perhaps it won't. Perhaps the days of grand narratives are over. Either way, the battle over stories will not end anytime soon. Why I am writing about this in the second chapter of a book on the COVID virus? Answer, if it is not clear by now, it is that the response to that virus has been filtered through precisely this process of narrative fracture. This, in turn, means when people look at what is going on, we filter what we see through an entirely different story. This is a situation that is experienced daily across the world right now, in families, in the workplace, online, in particular those who deviate from what I call the narrative. The establishment story about COVID and the response to it can expect short shrift or worse. It is difficult and frightening for many even to venture out with questions which go against the grain of the official wisdom. Now, the power of a truly great narrative is when it is invisible. You don't see it. You just believe you see the world as such. You see the world directly. You don't see the religion through which you use to categorize the world, that matrix of categories that have been imprinted with you, that have been assessed by your group. You just see the world as such. And again, if you look at Peterson talking on Rogan, you see patterns. You don't see objects, you see patterns. You see meaning before you see objects, and you see the objects through the meaning that you're using to see. Let's jump back into the Rebel Wisdom video about where we left it.
It feels like the thesis narrative is definitely shifting, and we'll come to that later on. But it's also interesting to see on the antithesis side how the same phenomenon is showing up, like the levels of certainty, the narrative warfare, conspiracy thinking. And for me, that's really part of the same phenomenon of religious thinking, which is something that John Beveke says, that we're in this frame of mind now where we're almost addicted to that sort of sense of insight and revelation of the conspiracy.
Paul Ricoeur calls the hermeneutics of suspicion, which is becoming a progressively dominant and, in fact, default automatic interpretive framework for most people in the culture. So now what happens is we take the exemplary moment of truth. That's what the moment of truth looks like. Our primary example is, aha, when we uncover the conspiracy or the cabal or the secret agenda, that's when truth discloses itself. And that's very problematic in a lot of ways, because it means that our fundamental, if this is our fundamental default interpretive stance, our fundamental attitude towards reality is one of, distrust, cynicism, and ultimately nihilism. And then that causes us to experience the world in a threatening way. And then the whole thing spins on itself in a vicious cycle. And it becomes very compelling.
And also just had this kind of frame of like, why this, why now? And I think it's because we all just want this to be over. Like everybody just wants this to be over now. And so what's showing up on the thesis side is, if we could only just get everybody vaccinated, it'd be over, even though logically that doesn't make sense for what we know about the way the vaccines work now. That kind of single-minded push that seems to kind of just have this sort of institutional force behind it doesn't make sense, which is something that Mary was pointing out and we covered in our interview. But on the other side, it's like, if we could just uncover this secret plot, then it would also be over. Like that's the kind of it's the same with QAnon. QAnon's a great example of that. On one level, it looks incredibly dark, torturing and killing children, etc., dark cabal who are controlling everything. But if you see it through a religious lens, you realize it's actually a utopian perspective just as much as it's dystopian, because it's just like, if we could only expose this cabal, we would then be in the promised land. We would then be in a utopian situation. Like it's the same kind of religious dimension.
So the hermeneutics of suspicion has been around for a long time, and you can go to Wikipedia. The hermeneutics of suspicion is a style of literary interpretation in which texts are read with skepticism in order to expose their purported repressed or hidden meanings. And this is a move that you can find almost endlessly in the woke conversations, that it's actually your racism or your sexism or your gender binary or your white supremacy, or all of these hidden things that are beneath the surface that are actually manifesting on top. You might not know they're manifesting on top, but they're sort of manifesting through you. And it's sort of Bulverisms 24/7. They're everywhere. And Nietzsche, it's power. For Freud, it's sex. For Marx, it's class struggle. And basically the world is just filled with all of these two-level theories, and you can pretty much interpret and dismiss the behavior of everyone around you based on whatever pet theory seems to motivate everything. Now, again, Jordan Peterson brought this up with Joe Rogan with respect to power, and it's kind of a simple, dumb trick that you can play, and you can play it all over the place. Now, if you want to know what a Bulverism is, again, you can look it up on Wikipedia. It's basically something that C.S. Lewis coined. It's something to the fact of, father doesn't want mother to do such and such a thing because father is a chauvinist. And anything that the father believes or asserts can simply be dismissed because of the assertion that father is a chauvinist. That's a Bulverism. And basically, we're simply awash in Bulverisms. And as David Fuller says, both sides in the current fracture of the narrative exposed by the pandemic asserts this. Well, the lockdowns and the masks are all motivated by someone to have power over us, and to a certain degree, Paul Kingsnorth suggests that. Now, who that actually is that an individual? Is that an individual with this conscious plot who is somehow in charge of everything and behind the scene pulling the strings? The other side, wants to blame the other side politically. Oh, it's the Democrats who are doing all of this. And both sides sort of imagine that there's something under the surface that is bubbling up. It might be a conscious person. It might be a conscious thing. But what happens is you wind up seeing two different worlds that are divided.
And so the other part of this piece that we'll also come to, these are just trails at the moment, and we'll kind of unpack it a little bit more in a minute. But the other thing is that we are in a place now where we actually need religious or occult terminology to start making sense of things. So we recently put out an interview with B.J. Campbell, which has kind of gone a little bit viral. It's been picked up by an awful lot of people on Twitter, and talking about this concept that he was using called the egregore, which is kind of like a hive mind.
All of the elements for the sense-making crisis create fertile ground for hive minds to develop, and the hive minds would exist at a layer up that you would not be able to tell that they existed.
And we've talked about this. I've done a video about this, and we've talked about this a fair amount.
Is that true? I don't know. It's the thing that I've been thinking about recently, and it seems very explanatory for some of the stuff that's going on.
And there's so many other dimensions that this situation touches on that we've talked about a lot on Rebel Wisdom before. In particular, kind of the problem of truth, the problem of the media, the problem of kind of a failing mainstream media and an alternative media where it's kind of like a Wild West. And I've talked about the uncanny valley between the two. I think these frameworks are really useful to kind of understand what's going on from a higher level, but you can't avoid like the basic facts of what is going on. What about the claims that are made by some of these people? So that's why I spoke to Rocky Jedick, who is a working ER doctor who's been kind of dealing with COVID right at the sharp end since the beginning. And he's also been tracking a lot of these people like Robert Malone for well over a year.
I first heard of Robert because they kind of paint this picture and go into this podcast on these podcasts.
Okay, I'm not really going to get into the data of the COVID disputes because, of course, the way that we want to try to get beyond these impasses of two-level theories is to get at the data and line all the propositions up and say, this is the truth out there. Now, probably something just as amazing as the dynamic of fractured narratives and the combat that they're in is the durability of the belief that you can resolve this by throwing more data at it. Where is the data to affirm that position? Now, I think part of the reason that Rebel Wisdom keeps using the word religious in there is because in many ways, religions are the original two-level theories. What do I mean by that? I suspect that you really didn't have a competition with religion until we had other competitors at this level offering their explanatory power to the kinds of differences that we see on this level and account for them. Okay? So instead of God or spirits or demons or that moving people, essentially a spirit first, matter second. Spirit is foundational. Matter is derivative from spirit. Spirit is foundational. Psychology is secondary. You couldn't really displace religious two-level theories until you had other things down below. Marx, Freud, Nietzsche. Until you had other things down below that could supplant this and then operate on this level. Now, what we're seeing is that we have a clear lack of sophistication with respect to the newer two-level theories. And when you have, let's say, a materialism first, that matter is primary and spirit is projected, nominalism, categories are projected, categories are therefore arbitrary. And when you look at, let's say, the work and impact of Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau, I think a lot of the foundation of their work has been convincing people that, well, there are, in fact, things moving. Now, you can have Brett Weinstein come along and say that evolutionary biology is at work at this level. And again, this then has explanatory power. The kinds of conflicts that we experience in these realms are, of course, not new. An ancient framework which imagined that when Babylon and Israel squared off and Israel lost, it was because the gods of Babylon were stronger. In a sense, it was a two-level theory that the visible manifestations, seen as basically the servants, because Israel was the servant of the Lord, the way Babylon was the servant of Marduk. Israel is the manifestation of the Lord, her witness in the world, as Babylon was the witness of Marduk in the world. That the competition between these cultures would reveal to the world which culture was greatest, which God was greatest, which God was truly the God over all the earth. And to a degree, when I make the point that the God of Israel continues to have power over the people in the world today as compared to, let's say, Marduk, well, it isn't a competition. Although in 586 BC, it looked very much like Marduk would be superior. But then, of course, the Persians would come in, and you also have the difference in terms of the interpretive framework about how Israel conceptualized their God and how Marduk and the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks conceptualized their gods. What they're looking for here is a synthesis. And if you listen to, let's say, Jordan Peterson's biblical series with his evolutionary polytheism to monotheism, Jordan Peterson basically posits sort of a synthesis in terms of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis process by which Jordan Peterson sees that, well, what happens with monotheism is you take all the gods and you integrate them into one. And this is Ali asking about, well, what kind of COVID synthesis do we hope for moving forward?
And the antithesis, obviously the question is, what might a synthesis look like? COVID synthesis. And for me, I think a place like that does exist, even though it's hard to discern in the way that the conversation is just fragmenting and fragmenting and fragmenting. But I think it's something like showing up the holes in the thesis narrative and applying a level of skepticism to the more extreme versions of the antithesis narrative. I feel like there's a responsible heterodoxy that is showing up in a way of kind of criticizing where the thesis is going off the rails. But it's also in applying skepticism to the antithesis. And it's like, it seems very difficult for us to do that. It seems that it's like the God-shaped hole. The idea of, I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said, when a man stops believing in God, he'll believe in anything.
I think just on that,
well, before we get Ali in there, now, what will probably happen with COVID in this respect? It will lose the attention of the world. And when it loses its attention, the thesis and the antithesis, will sort of lose their clients, and it will sort of settle down as many things settle down in history. Whether it will endure won't be known. Data will, of course, come into being. And once the data loses its manifestations in the different combatants, then after it loses attention, after it loses worship, it will sort of be like, well, do you really care? Do you really have a dog in the fight between, let's say, Zeus and Apollo, or Zeus and Hera? It'll just sort of be out there, and there'll be different theories about them, but in that sense, those gods lose their clients. Again, it's sort of like American gods and Neil Gaiman's idea.
As we've been talking a lot about what is the synthesis, because that feels like a very important thing to come out in culture. But there's a lot of talk often about holding multiple perspectives, which is very important. But there's less talk about actually sort of embodying and feeling the perspectives. And I think there's a very important element with that, with the synthesis, is that
and what he's basically talking about is these let's say the angels of COVID. The angel of COVID thesis, the angel of COVID antithesis, they lose their power in the world. Now, they might shrink down, and there might be fierce battles in certain hospitals and medical school departments with respect to the minutia of it. Those angels might get demoted. Other angels are going to arise and take their place at the center of the national zeitgeist, on the stage, as it were.
We feel the emotional drivers behind each position simultaneously, and we're able to hold those as well as thinking of the different truth statements that they have. So I think it's important to include both of those, because people don't...
Now this is where you get into the idea of non-player characters. In many ways, non-player characters are sort of possessed by a spirit. And one shows spiritual capacity when they can sort of see these spirits, hold them at bay, and participate in that spiritual realm. And in fact, perhaps help in the creation, or at least the forthcoming, of other spirits into the arena that probably chase some of these other spirits from the arena. Now, in talking like this, I sound probably absolutely insane. Now, one of the videos that cropped up in that a viewer sent me was what happened on the Timcast, and I found this absolutely extraordinary.
That's why when, Alex Jones says that the real enemy is like an alien intelligence, it makes it feel like we're all in this together up against the true evil. It's just unfortunately not true. Humans are against humans.
When I was a kid, I remember, well, not a kid, when I was like...
That, now again, when he says humans are against humans, ideas... people don't have ideas, ideas have people. Well, what do you mean by ideas? What are ideas? Something is possessing humans to do things and to move them. And again, well, what second level theories are you using? And it's very interesting that this woman then brings up this point here.
Good. In my 20s, I knew all these people who were claiming that there was actually a war going on between angels and demons in this other sphere. And that, we could
She was probably reading Frank Peretti books and This Present Darkness, which was a hugely popular book in the 1980s.
Sort of tap into that other war. And I was like, wow, you guys have way better drugs than me. What's going on?
Yeah, I think of demons as like energy patterns that can be catalyzed.
I have no idea what this is about. But
and then even the translation of energy patterns that can be catalyzed. Well, what's he trying to do? He's trying to bring it into scientific speak. Energy patterns that can be catalyzed. Sounds very science-y, rather than, using spirit names or images from This Present Darkness. But these are the kinds of things that people wonder, because you look at someone and you say, well, I was listening to a conversation the other day, and someone mentioned, well, that person said that probably because it's the good old boys in this state, in this other state. And it's like, okay, well, what are you asserting? You asserting that there's this spirit that takes possession mostly of men, mostly in a geography, and it perpetuates itself. And you can just add more and more second level theories into this. Well, this is a desire for power, or this is a desire to control women's bodies, or this is, and you can just keep throwing it on without ever, and this is C.S. Lewis's point with bulverisms, without ever talking about the validity of the ideas. Another thing that I've been thinking about is on Twitter, there's all of this discussion now around Jordan Peterson on Joe Rogan. So I posted, because I can basically post a bunch of things on Twitter that I can't play on YouTube. Someone from after I posted it, responding to, basically said that there are a bunch of, Andy Rowell said there are a lot of people, quote, tweeting these two segments from the Jordan Peterson interview yesterday on climate and then the book. And then he grabs this example from a Jay Van Bavel. Jordan was on my dissertation committee, and I used to have a lot of respect for him. He was once a great interdisciplinary thinker and a deeply anti-authoritarian. It's tragic to see him go down this rabbit hole of pseudo-profound BS, anti-science nonsense, and xenophobia. Xenophobia? Now, what's interesting is that, again, you attack the person. Well, why not attack the ideas? Why attack the person? It's not unintelligent, because the person is an actor. And even though you're making all sorts of statements about who the person is and what's happening through the person, you really care about the throughness of the person, and you want the person to stop being a spiritual actor.
Like, a synthesis also means people from different sides coming to a shared understanding. I think it doesn't mean like a gray area where we're like, well, this is true and this is also true, and can't we all just get along? Wouldn't that be?
And that's what happens when the spirit recedes. That spirit's not so important. We're not offering that spirit worship/attention anymore.
Nice. That's not a synthesis. That's a kind of weird gray zone, which is kind of a cop-out. I think a real synthesis is a connecting thing. It connects the two sides. So part of that is for each of us, whichever way
Now again, once that spirit recedes, there's other spirits that take its place. Rebel Wisdom will talk about something else on their channel. I'll talk about something else on my channel. And again, well, is it us moving this forward, or is it something between us that is moving us in these predictable ways?
we lean more, and we are going to lean somewhere, is that we try and put it's empathy. It's just really simple. So put ourselves in the shoes of the other position and think, what are they actually saying? What are they actually saying? What are they worried about? What are they hopeful for? What are they concerned about? And try
and what are they worried about? What are they hopeful for? Okay, now psychology has become sort of the two-level theory that we're not actually evaluating, again, back to Bulverism, we're not actually trying to evaluate a truth, an accessible truth about such and such a thing. We're looking at the talker. We're looking at the mover. We're looking at the thing that the stuff underneath is moving.
And imagine what it would feel like to be in that position. That, for me, is synthesis. So I think one of the most useful ideas...
And even that move, notice how we do that. I want to imagine what that feels like. Well, what does that look like? It looks like me leaving my body, coming into you. Not really your body. Coming into you. What? Your story. All of the stuff that makes you an extended spiritual being in this world. I sort of try to imaginatively take on myself, and then via that run a simulation basically in me to try to see the world from your perspective. And again, with the exaptation, we imagine we do this all with our bodies and eyes and ears and that, But none of that is actually happening. We're playing it all in our imagination, almost as if we're plugged into some matrix and we're running a simulation as in the Matrix. That's similar to what we do all the time with our imaginations.
We've come across thinking about this is actually inspired by John Vervaeke, and it's this insight that the same cognitive machinery that makes us intelligent also leads us to self-deception. And it's just really fundamental.
Okay, now this does get into a lot of John's theory with respect to relevance realization. And Ollie's going to lay this out, I think, quite nicely, and I'm going to work on it a little bit, maybe sharpen it up if I can.
Because I think if we really take that on board, it leads us back to this concept of epistemic humility, which is having humility around what we don't know. And what's also, I think, really interesting about it is that, as Vervaeke points out, what actually makes us intelligent as humans is our ability to bias out information that's irrelevant to us and hone in from all the things that are salient, like calling for our attention, hone in on what's relevant to me and my goals and the thing I'm looking for. And he points out that we're having a lot of trouble getting AI to do that, right? It's something that's like innately a part of human intelligence. But it's also the thing that means that we are inherently biased. Like intelligence, you could see as bias. It is bias. It's selection process. So bias gets a bad rap. It's like, oh, you're biased. Well, you're seeing. It's like, of course you are. We are all biased. That is what it is to be a human being. So there are ways we can mitigate that, which we'll talk about in a little bit, different practices and frameworks that help us.
Okay, let's talk about this a little bit. So you've got combinatorial explosiveness. What does that mean? And you'll hear Jordan Peterson talk about this quite a bit. The world is too big for us to process. We have to make decisions. There's a value hierarchy that shapes us. It's different from, let's say, a Neoplatonic hierarchy of being. And we're going to have to talk about some of those issues at some point. The world is too big for us to process. We have to break the world down. How do we know what to select? Again, I used the story recently of if I walk in my office and the Queen of England is sitting in my office chair with a gun pointed at me. What happens in my value hierarchy? Do I first say, wow, what is the Queen of England doing in my office chair? Or do I first see the gun and say, a gun is pointed at me, and then I look at the Queen of England. The Queen of England is in my office chair pointing a gun at me. Now, my office could be filled with blow-up pink flamingos, and I wouldn't pay any attention to them. Why? Relevance realization. And what Ollie rightly notes is that relevance realization in Vervaeke's system is sort of a shortcut to intelligence. Intelligence is the capacity to pay attention to that which is relevant. And relevant to what? Now, one might say, why is your office full of pink flamingos? That's not relevant. Why is the Queen of England in your office? Well, that's sort of relevant. Why is she holding a gun at you? That's really relevant. And that's intelligence. It would be stupid to walk in my office, ignore the Queen of England pointing a loaded gun at me. How do I know it's loaded? I'm simply going to assume that it's loaded. You get back into Brett Weinstein, Sam Harris's conversation about metaphorical knowledge and say, oh my goodness, look at all the pink flamingos. Bang. Well, sorry, you lose. So this relevance realization is this way that we discern, and we talk about it in terms of intelligence. You can talk about it in evolutionary tales, but notice that all of these things are sort of taking on second level theory aspects as we talk about them. And then the question is, what forms the relevance realization that says, pay attention to the gun first, the Queen of England second, and the flamingos third? Why that hierarchy? Why that order? Not the flamingos first, the Queen of England second, and the gun first and the gun third. Why? Well, because, and someone might say, well, it's because of your evolution. I would say, well, guns are a very recent development in terms of human history. 1,000 years ago, if someone were to walk into my office, the same office that is filled with desks and books and computers, on top of them pink flamingos, in my office chair, a woman, an elderly woman wearing nice, moderate clothing and holding a very strange thing in their hand, they might see the pink flamingos and not the woman, and have no idea what else she's holding in her hand. Now, in her other hand, she might have that nice little purse, and they might, in fact, look at the purse. Bang, they're done. Oh, sorry, you lose. Am I more intelligent? No, I have been possessed. I am the product of, I have been educated into a whole series of filters through which all of this stuff has come into my picture of the world. If you listen to Jordan Peterson recently too, he keeps talking about the fact that we sort of see memory. What does that mean? Well, that gun, I have all these memories of guns I've seen in movies, or guns I've seen in soldiers' hands, or guns I've seen in other people's hands. Gun has salience to me, and very high salience. I remember when we lived in the Dominican Republic and my son was quite small. He was 6 or under because we left when he was 6, and he was over at the neighbor's house, and he was playing with the neighbor's boy, and he comes home one day, and why did you come home? Well, so-and-so's father had a gun on the table, and that didn't make me feel good, so I came home. So even a child knew what a gun was. In fact, a little later when we moved to Sacramento, I remember one of the moms of the Sunday school class wanted to go around the churchyard and pick up all the sticks because she was concerned because the little boys were picking up the sticks and using them as swords and guns. And so we're going to pick up all the sticks because we don't want them playing gun games in the churchyard. And the question was, well, what are you going to do with their fingers? You're going to bind their little hands? Well, little boys are going to do what little boys do. And, are you concerned that they're going to poke each other's, if you use their sticks as swords, is that worse than using their sticks as guns? On and on and on and on you go with this. But the questions are, where does this framework come from? Now, I'm not one to dismiss two-level theories as such, because in many respects, religion is such a two-level theory. And there have been lots of swapping, understanding what is foundational to the world that we're living in. But there's a culture. There's a network of categories that we have inherited, and these things are very old, and we pick them up and we operate within them via language, via values, and again, back to the Joe Rogan thing, I'm really only about halfway through it, but when I just paused now because I was going to make this video and I had other work to do, Jordan Peterson had just asked Joe Rogan, how do children learn language? And this is where we get into narrative and the place of narrative in our formation. And really, if you're taking the presumption of the first personal, if you're prioritizing that means, then as sort of Paul Kingsnorth and Jonathan Peugeot would say, the world is narrative. That's foundational because you've taken the first personal. You take the third personal, then you're much more in the realm of objects thing because you're sort of hovering above and you're trying to see the world in that way. So these biases, this relevance realization that Vervaeke uses sort of at the center of his system is intelligence, and it's the process by which we sort through the combinatorial explosive nature of the world and act within it. And that's why biases are not going anywhere. And again, look at Jordan Peterson's recent conversation with Chloe Valdery. And I thought Peterson was very good in there in terms of talking about biases. Racism basically is part of what happens when bias meets world. You can't get rid of bias. You need bias. But what happens when biases are sort of socially accumulated and one group of people has biases against another group of people in their struggles?
Kind of zoom out and zoom in. But one of the key things about that is that we have different senses of what is relevant. We're all looking at a different piece of the puzzle. And so our relevance, our understanding of relevance is different. And John Vervaeke points out that that is actually a huge part of the problem in what's happening between this clash of the thesis and antithesis around COVID, also around many other issues, is that we don't have a shared sense of what is relevant. And if we don't have a shared sense of what's relevant, how on earth are we going to have a conversation that goes anywhere useful? Because we're actually seeing different realities.
Here's the thing. If you and I are going to argue at the propositional level, what we do is we try and amass evidence, right? But evidence is dependent on shared judgments of relevance.
Okay, right there. Evidence is dependent on shared judgments of relevance. In other words, the very data you select, and with something as massive as a pandemic, where there is combinatorial explosiveness all over the place. Why did he get the infection and she did not? How many variables are involved in there? And the way we try to get beyond the innumerable variables in two individuals is we sort of make matters worse and better at the same time by doing statistics. So we're going to look at massive numbers of people. Try to get up there in the third personal. The difficulty that you have is, what do you care about? Whether your loved one, we often think more about our loved ones. Look at Peterson's rules in terms of treat yourself as though you were someone responsible to be cared for. What if your loved one got it? What if it's your mother or your grandmother or your child? None of them are a statistic because it's first personal. And the data, well, we're trying to manage all of this data and we think, well, let's let science decide. And what we're trying to say is we want to swoop up here, third personalize it, say that the world is full of objects of data, and that's how we'll fix this. Well, nobody is a statistic, even though we all are parts of statistics. And so what John persuasively points to here is you can't really solve any of this with data.
What we do is we try and amass evidence, right? But evidence is dependent on shared judgments of relevance. If I point to this and say it's evidence of that, and you go, that's irrelevant, because here's the secret fact behind that, right? If we do not have a shared, right, apprehension of relevance, that's the hermeneutics of beauty, by the way, then trying to point to evidence is irrelevant, because you will just dismiss or reinterpret. You will alter the relevance of any proposition I utter, and you will change its status. And I will say, but this is a central thing that counts as evidence for that. And you'll say, that's all irrelevant. You'll say, here's all these lab results showing how important the virus is. And you'll say, that's irrelevant because the labs are all corrupted by funding and, metapharma and all that. Or if you go the opposite way and say, well, look, here's the evidence for, right, that it's all corrupted. And the other person will say, but that hasn't been subject to scientific experimentation. And you'll just go blah, 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 blah. And that's what's happening. Exactly. That's what's happening.
And what's the way out then, John?
The point is to realize that who's winning in that isn't either side. Who's winning are, right? Who's winning is kind of like these anonymous, I'm not positing a conspiracy theory, I'm just saying, are these anonymous forces of the continual degradation of our capacity to be in contact with reality. We're all losing.
So the other part of that is that we're all making sense if we're making sense from a biased position, we're making sense from a place that is based on our kind of geographical location, it's based on our biographical history, it's based on so many other factors. And with COVID especially, I think there's such a different world depending on where you are in the world, depending on your vaccination status, which is really interesting. I'm vaccinated. Speaking to friends who are unvaccinated, they are almost literally experiencing a different reality. And listening to them and kind of having empathy for that is really interesting. Like recognizing, we went to Berlin fairly recently where you had to show your vaccine passport to get a beer. And even though I could do it, there was something that felt very off about that, like really off. And interestingly, in the UK, we've never had that. We've never had a vaccine status deciding your entrance to restaurants, deciding your entrance to bars or any of that stuff. And it's that feels very wrong from a British perspective. Like I think we've got a very strong kind of negative liberty bias in the UK. Going about your kind of daily business has never been controlled in that way. Whereas I know friends who live in Canada, especially who are unvaccinated, who can't go to restaurants, can't go to bars, like that feels incredibly different. And I really fucking don't like being told what to do. Any kind of sense of being told what to do like really rubs me up the wrong way. So I really identify with people who kind of feel that way. And I think if I lived in somewhere like Australia, let alone Germany or Austria, where they are actually kind of going down the full-on kind of segregation of society based on vaccination status, is crazy. Like and I think it would be much more relevant to me than it is living in the UK, where I'm lucky enough to be able to work from home a lot of the time, to be able to kind of masking in London has been pretty much, you wear it in shops, no one really wears it out on the street. I was in Mexico last year and they had a rule that you had to wear your mask on the street, and armed police kind of basically enforcing that you had to wear masks on the street. It's like, fuck you. That would be a completely different situation.
Okay, let's keep going with this. So this is the picture I drew last time, where sort of your religion is your grand interpretive filter through which you interpret the combinatorial explosiveness of the world, what you determine is relevant. I was talking to Jacob. Jacob was up again on Sunday. And, he had mentioned that the Hasidic community, for example, decided that when COVID hit, they were basically going to see the death of many of their seniors as acceptable losses because, well, they didn't fear death. And this is what happens. And this is the best way for the community to get through. Many churches have made different calculations. And in fact, you can find some churches, canceling for months and months and months at a time, while other churches saying, we're not going to be canceled at all. We're going to all be in the same room and we're going to sing. And that, of course, gets filtered through the archetypes and the laws of various different countries, so that in the United States, for many churches in California, because of the First Amendment, the government couldn't stop them from holding services. Whereas, Jonathan Peugeot tells me that in Quebec, you need a vaccine passport in order to, in fact, even get in a church. Now, take a look at this drawing, and I'm going to make another drawing. Having this picture with, in a sense, the religion outside the person doesn't really do it justice. The religion is really, of course, inside the person. And what makes up the religion is actually a whole bunch of other people. It's perhaps something analogous to my consciousness Congress, that you're actually filtering all of this stuff through a community. And it's not, obviously, they're not tiny little people inside our little noggins. What there is the historical accumulation of all of these people, in many respects, their spirits. Now, again, if I talk in that language, you'll say, wow, Paul, this sounds like all kinds of ancient religions where inside of me are the spirits of my ancestors. Well, yeah, that's true. The spirits of your ancestors are inside of you. They might be some of your biological ancestors, but they're also the ancestors of the religious tradition that you inhabit. For example, sometime in the 19th century, on my father's side, the Jews somehow, whether it was when they went to Western Michigan because they knew Dutch and they'd been living with Jews in northern Netherlands, and when they came to Spring Lake, Michigan, they decided it's best to be Christian Reformed. And in fact, I had a wonderful conversation with Jacob about the history of Judaism and the development of conservative Judaism and Orthodox Judaism and Reformed Judaism, and this is all passing through these massive waves of modernity and Germany and all of that history. Well, somehow engrafted in me was Abram Kuyper, the Aufskyting, John Calvin, Augustine, Martin Luther, and say, no, but you're a Jew, but I have the spirit of Augustine and Paul of Tarsus and Jesus of Nazareth, and I have the spirit of all of these individuals inside of me, and I am apprehending the world in many ways through them. Now, if you look at my conversation that I posted today with Sam and with John, and this apprehension of the world, as Jordan Peterson says to Joe Rogan, has everything to do with patterns. The world is made up of patterns in a much more foundational way, especially for us, than it is of simply objects. The objects are disposable, interchangeable, especially in comparison with the patterns. Northrop Frye talks about metaphor, and metaphor is the central pattern, I would have to say, of the transmission between upper and lower register. Metaphor says one thing is another. And here in this second lecture, he has all this U shape of things on top and things on bottom. And what the Bible does is says one thing is another.
Of two witnesses in the last day. It's one of the prophecies of what is going to happen at the end of time. And the verse reads, "Their bodies shall lie in the street of that great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where our Lord was crucified." That is, spiritually, metaphorically, Sodom, Egypt, and the earthly Jerusalem are all the same city. And similarly, in the symbolism of the Bible, Egypt, Babylon, and Rome are all symbolically the same tyranny. And the Pharaoh of the Exodus, the Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and the persecuting Caesars of Rome, of whom Nero is particularly the type, are metaphorically or spiritually the same person.
Now, again, someone might say, well, Rome is not Babylon, is not Egypt, is not Sodom. Spiritually, what are they talking about? Well, they're on one hand, they're talking about this interpretive framework from the perspective of Israel, Babylon and Rome, and Antiochus Epiphanes and Syria, and Sodom that tries to capture Lot, and all of these things are the same city from the perspective of Rome in terms of the relevance realization of the patterns in the world. You get into the New Testament because he's quoting from something in the book of Revelation, and there's been a transposition where Christians are now standing in the place of Israel. And you might say, well, no, but I thought they were Jews. But watch all of those categories too, because all of that is in play. And so when people look at masks, they say, oh, well, masks are Jewish stars that Nazis put on clothes. You say, what? A mask is not a Jewish star. Yes, they are. Why? It's how it functions in the system, how it functions in the narrative. This is spiritually how these things are working. So basically, you continue to have sort of a two-level system because, again, if spirit is first and matter is subservient to spirit, the wind blows the trees and you don't know, John chapter 3, where the wind is coming from or going to. You just see the tree move. And remember, spirit and wind are the same word. Well, this is what's blowing through history. You see COVID masks as, oh, this is how we're going to be safe from the virus. And the other side sees COVID masks as, oh, this is the means of control by which we're going to initiate all of this other religious comings and goings. Now I want to play a bit of a video that was recommended to me by a guest that was on Karen Wong's channel, Meaning Code, about basically the challenge of figural readings. And you can see this as symbolic. You can see it in many other respects. And this is given by a New Testament scholar named Richard Hayes, who has really done some of the most outstanding New Testament scholarship that we've seen in this generation.
With an extraordinary hermeneutical challenge. It's a challenge that's expressed succinctly in Jesus' words in John 5:46. If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. What could John the Evangelist mean by advancing such an audacious and extraordinary claim? In what sense can Moses, who lived many hundreds of years before, be said to have written about Jesus? And what would it mean for us to believe that such an assertion might be true? Modern critical scholarship has been deeply skeptical of all claims that the Old Testament writings should be read as predictive prophecy or as coded Christological messages. But what sort of a hermeneutical landscape might open up before us? What might open up before us if we learn to read Israel's scripture not only through the filtering lenses of modern critical methods, but also through the eyes of John and the other authors of the canonical Gospels? Careful attention to the distinctive narrative design of the New Testament writings leads us to focus on patterns of intertextuality that are deeply woven into these texts. That's one of those $64 words that scholars use. It simply means the way in which later texts incorporate into themselves earlier texts, so that you have a weaving together of older and newer texts. Tonight I want to draw particular attention to the ways in which the four canonical Gospels are hermeneutically intertwined with the scriptures of Israel. And the more closely that I've tried to study this remarkable phenomenon, the more I've been drawn to this conclusion. The Old Testament teaches us how to read the Gospels, and at the same time, the Gospels teach us how to read the Old Testament. I want to suggest to you that the key to this dialectic of intertextuality is a practice called figural reading. Figural reading. That simply means discerning unexpected patterns of correspondence between earlier and later events or persons within a continuous temporal stream. This term figural reading or figural interpretation comes from the German scholar Erich Auerbach. He's a scholar not of the Bible so much, but of world literature in general. I want to read you his concise, though dense, definition of figural interpretation. If a few of you who do have the book in front of you, this is on page 2 in my book, where I quote from Auerbach. He writes, now listen, I realize this is compactly expressed, so I'm going to read it slowly, and I may even have to read it more than once, because I want to be sure you get this. He writes, figural interpretation establishes a connection between two events or persons in such a way that the first signifies not only itself, but also signifies the second, while the second involves or fulfills the first.
Now, what you see right there is almost every incidence of meaning. If we in fact had no pandemic and someone suggested, oh, there's some dangerous things in this room, would you put on a mask? Well, of course. Would not have interpreted that mask as a Jewish star that a Nazi desired to put on a Jew in the Second World War. It would have had a completely different interpretive background. Meaning is in many ways, Jordan Peterson talks about this with Joe Rogan, is in many ways the intertextuality between the way we put together these events.
The two poles of a figure are separated in time, but both are real events or persons. Both are within temporality. They're both contained in the flowing stream, which is historical life, and only the comprehension of their interdependence is a spiritual act. Only the comprehension. So you see what he's saying? Two poles, an earlier event, a later event, and they cast light in unexpected ways on one another when they're read together. Let me give
you look at the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol building. Every day, people go into that Capitol building. Every day, there have been tours in that Capitol building. American citizens have walked in an orderly manner in that Capitol. Why did the events of January 6th, why were those events different? Well, people behaved differently. They had different symbols on them. And in fact, the entire, almost every political fight is about the interpretation between different events in history, or even different stories in history, and whether or not they have had a degree of physical manifestation and valence is important in terms of what we imagine to be possible in this world. But even those expectations are built within what we're talking about. So part of what, and this is a terrific lecture, and he goes on, and it's very accessible. It's not technical at all. Part of what we're talking about here is, in fact, this question of who makes up the people and the tradition through which you see the world. And this fractured narrative basically asserts that, well, these dynamics actually, let's see if I can, that in fact COVID is just one little piece of an entire world of these issues. And you're going to, well, inflation, turmoil in the Ukraine, maybe you had a fight with your wife, your health, cancer, existential issues. All of these are happening, but all of this is, of course, nested in an enormous story. And, well, Jordan Peterson says to Joe Rogan, well, our world is constructed from this book. Well, yes, it is. Very much so. It's basically Tom Holland's thesis. And the book is constructed of the people and all of these relationships, and the relevance realization that is happening has been constructed by generations and generations and generations of people and their spirits that continue to live on inside of you and govern what's going on today.
There's an article that's literally just come out, again in Unheard, by Freddie Sayers, talking about how the UK has kind of responded to COVID. And he says, England is now uniquely positioned to lead the world out of the COVID era. The fact that this government managed to restrain from imposing freedom curtailing restrictions over Christmas against the advice of an array of activist scientists and the Labour Party was a decision of global consequence. Across Europe, lockdowns returned in response to Omicron and did little to prevent huge surges in cases. From Italy to California, the obsessive focus on vaccine passports, more pointless and divisive than ever in the face of Omicron, has intensified in the last months, while England has all but steered clear of them, save for occasional use at larger events. Many Western countries have managed to create a new underclass of the non-vaccinated from previous law-abiding citizens, who will now be alienated and radicalised for years to come. England has mainly avoided this. Our society is strained, but it will hold.
Now I draw this picture and you, based on the context, immediately say things like, oh, that's the UK. Just like Rome and Babylon. That's the USA. That's Germany. That's Canada. And we see the differences between these nations, and the article talks about, well, the UK, we think, has managed to operate this better, whereas the United States is perhaps having some anxiety and disunion, and Canada is certainly getting stressed, and Germany is revisiting, well, just again, read Paul Kingsnorth's article and many other articles and saying, they've been busy in Germany. Recently, they put fences up in Hamburg to separate the bad unvaxxed from the good vaxxed at the Christmas markets. A ghetto? Do the fences in the markets remind us of the ghettos separating the vermin? Just look at all that property. One thing is, no, those are totally separate things. No, those are the same things. The community through history, the spirits that inhabit us, make us say that, well, Babylon and Rome are the same thing. Fences in the market in Germany and fences around ghettos in Poland are the same thing in Warsaw. The mood certainly seems ripe. A cartoon recently published in the mainstream high circulation newspaper featured a man sitting at his sofa playing a first-person shooter game in which the targets were unvaccinated people. The caption described it as a big hit under the Christmas tree. Ha ha ha, I think. Germany. Fences, internment, forced injections, armed police, scan your codes, shoot the unvaxxed. One thing is another. The relevance realization comes up through the spirit of the people through time. And what happens, well, you have a culture when these spirits cohere together, but when the spirits pull apart and fall apart, well, you begin to have different questions about what are these nations. They are principalities. We have John Bull and Uncle Sam, and your relevance realization arises from the spirits of your ancestors and forms into powerful, we don't even have names for them, that govern us, that shape how we see the world. These are the interpretive frameworks through which we see and then speak and then act and then teach our children and then vote. Yes, it's very much religious. Yes, it's very difficult to see how this will ever be divorced from story. This is the way of the world. It's the way the world has always been. Well, we want to know the truth. Yeah, you do. And it's important. And how can we figure it out? Well, we keep talking. So this wasn't so bad that I'm going to delete it, but I'll be very interested to see what you think.